next few minutes, what I wanted to talk a little bit more about was just the grazing principles that we typically employ when we talk about regenerative ranching. And that's a term that Noble uses. You know, we heard David say a little bit, you know, he hates terms. I hate terms. Most producers don't want to be classified one way or the other. Conventional, regenerative, sustainable. They just want to be recognized for doing what's right for the land. And so what we really talk about at Noble is grazing land stewardship for improved soil health and profitability. Now, is anybody against that? Nobody that I know of should be. And that's where our focus is. But the definition, regenerative ranching, really works for us at Noble because our founder, Lloyd Noble, back in 1945, started the Samuel Roberts Noble Foundation, naming it after his dad, who said who he claimed to be the most generous man he ever knew. That's quite a high honor. But he became an oil man, and the people that worked in the oil fields that became his employees came off of where? Farms and ranches. He said these were the people that understood the value of a day's work and a day's pay. He also knew that these were the guys that were working for him for one reason only, because they couldn't make a living on the land by itself. So he wanted to give back to the land. So as he'd fly across these different oil fields, you know, he was an early pioneer of aviation, you know, time was money. So he'd travel across these places and he'd see where Oklahoma in particular, there were lands that were farmed that never should have been broken to the plow. Now, do y'all have any land like that up here? I think we all know of areas that should have never been broken to plow that were, and our topsoil is about like this in many places. Now, you got some farmland, but for the most part, it should not have been anything but grazing land. But he'd fly across that and he saw all these old fields, because there used to be a lot of cotton grown out there, they were left abandoned because they didn't really know what to do. And this is in the 20s and 30s, and then he saw the Dust Bowl. And so he said, you know, we've got to give back to the land, because long after the oil and gas is gone, the land has to continue to provide the food, the fiber, and the lumber in order to support the people itself. So he understood and really was a very conservation-minded. So he started Noble Foundation in 1945. Unfortunately, he died in 1950 at the age of 54 years of age. Really, really young. But his family understood what his original intent is. And right now, our board of trustees for the Noble Foundation and the Samuel Roberts Noble Foundation and Noble Research Institute are descendants of Lloyd Noble. And they study that, the writings that he had, also the recordings that were made of him. And a lot was made about improving the soil. So that's what we did. We were set up to help farmers and ranchers to meet their goals. It was what he gave back to the community. So we were really focused around the Southern Great Plains. And then when we finally got to a point where we understood a little bit more about soil health. You know, I'm going to back up for a second. How many of y'all went to college and took a soils class? A lot of us did. And I remember Dr. Murray Milford, first day of class, he says, guys, there are 3 components to the soil. What are they? Well, components. Physical, chemical, and biological. He says, we're going to spend half the semester on the physical. And then we're going to spend about half the semester on the chemical. He says, we're going to spend about a half a lecture on the biological. He says, but soil is supposed to be a living system. And the only part about those 3 components that's living is the biology. He says the science has not caught up, but it will someday. The science is catching up now. And because of that, our board of directors looked at that. Our president that became president in 2017, I believe is right, they began to really look at the mission and then brought in some people from all across the country that were well recognized in the ag industry. And they said, what can Noble Research Institute be best in class across the country? And they came back and it was said, grazing land, soil health for profitability, you know, for improved soil health and profitability. So that's where our mission was. And so we redesigned our whole organization. We no longer do plant biology work. We no longer do plant breeding work. We do research on a landscape scale. We do education, and that's what we've spent quite a bit of time trying to develop it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get forward, what that education centers around, and it is soil health, grazing management, and profitability. So these are the areas that we're going to figure is the basis for any type of agricultural operation, at least in the area where we're going to put emphasis, because there's not a whole lot of money going to grazing land work. A lot more in the crop work, which is wonderful, but we thought we could do that, and that's where we're leading our direction. So with that, regenerative makes a lot of sense to us. Our founder wanted to revitalize, rebuild, regenerate the soil. I don't care what other people think about it. It's our definition, regenerative ranching, so that's what we're going to do. But the key role of this for us centers around grazing management, and that's where my passion, that's where my career has centered around. I've got a master's studying the grazing dynamics of beef cattle in a rapidly declining forage regime as a result of Alan Savory. Now, a lot of people haven't liked a lot of what he said, didn't like the mannerism in which he came in and broadcast how the United States really didn't know what we were doing over here in grazing management. But the reality is there's a lot of truisms in what he's taught. And it also got me a master's degree that didn't cost me a whole lot. So I was pretty happy about all that. What we really want to be able to focus now is what does it mean towards soil health? Because if you look at the holistic resource management, it's about changes across the landscape, using it livestock as a tool, but the true test is below the soil surface. If we're really rebuilding soil, really regenerating soil, the evidence is going to be in the soil itself. So now that's where our focus is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about grazing principles, lessons from Noble Ranches. 3 years ago, we changed over all our ranches to regenerative management, and we went cold turkey. Now, I'll tell you, I wouldn't recommend most people do that when you've got introduced pasture that was dependent on nitrogen and phosphorus for decades. I mean, decades, long before I ever got there. So we're seeing that we have a need for nitrogen. If we're trying to put carbon in the soil, we got to have carbon growing in the soil and above the soil, and the only way we get carbon is to have nitrogen. We have organic matters of less than 1% on a lot of those places. We need carbon. So we're learning what we can do without anything, and then we're also learning what we can do to recommend to producers as to how they get there quicker. All that to say, let's get started. Where do we begin when we think about grazing principles? Well, for us, it still goes back to the 6 principles of soil health. I'm sure y'all talked about it. We're out there in the field with the corn and the soybeans. We talked a little bit about it there at our grazing location. And it really boils down to knowing your context, keeping the soil covered, managing so that you minimize soil disturbance, and grazing is a disturbance. Trampling is a disturbance. But the whole idea is to minimize, not do it. What we want to do is minimize the damage. So really focusing on short periods of disturbance. Maintain your continuous living roots. In other words, focusing around the perennial plants as much as possible. In cropland scenarios, you're just maintaining some sort of living root year-round, whether it be annuals or cool seasons. Increasing diversity, and of course, integrating livestock. If you're grazing cattle, you're integrated livestock. But oftentimes, we as producers stop short of there. Noble Research Institute, we have grazed cattle since the 1950s. The original winter pasture stocker program in the Southern Great Plains, that originated at Noble Research Institute. How many heard of Elbon rye? Elbon rye, cereal rye. That's just Noble spelled backwards. That was our original plant breeding effort, was that cereal rye. Now it's one of the most used cover crops that's out there. But we had that out there, and being able to integrate livestock within those components really makes it to where we have an opportunity to do something different other than just look across the landscape. Our soil health principles, even though we have practices that are tailored toward our own context and our own regions, we still got to be focused on the ecosystem processes. So our grazing management is focusing on which of these do we need to improve the most. If you're down at Noble and looking at some of our properties, we've got a lot of those that need to be fixed. It's a matter of what is the most limiting factor that we need to focus our practices around. So this is where we start. And then we really get into the grazing. Now there's several things that we want to keep in mind about grazing management is there is an hierarchy of importance. The first one is, which everybody can manage, is your stocking rate. We want to make sure that our stocking rate is less than carrying capacity. Now there's some issues with that, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But it is a challenge. How do you manage your stocking rate when carrying capacity fluctuates year to year and across the season? And that's what we've got to keep in mind, is that we want to make sure we're not grazing too heavily. Because I'm sure y'all have heard many times, you can undergraze and overgraze the pasture simultaneously. We want to make sure that we're intentionally grazing what we want for the outcomes we've desired. Then we really get into the variables that I call of grazing, which is intensity, frequency, timing, and duration. And when I think about intensity, what is the post-grazing residual that we desire? And we'll talk more about each of these here shortly. Frequency, the recovery of grazed plants. How often are we coming back? That's where we're looking at recovery. And we'll talk about the difference between rest and recovery too here. Timing, the season of use, stage of maturity, state of recovery. And notice I put recovery down, not just rest, state of recovery that we want to look at. You know, when we get into these timing issues, when was it grazed last? What was the state of recovery when it hit frost on those warm season grasses? Because it makes a difference. And if we know where those are, we can adjust our grazing so that those areas that were grazed last and never got a full chance to recover, maintain that recovery earlier in the spring. Give it a little extra recovery, because just because it went over winter doesn't mean it's really recovered. Duration, the length of the grazing interval. That's the last thing that we want to focus on. If we can handle all these other areas first, that's your priority. And then when you have time on the areas that you can focus your efforts, then we can really move into what I call the duration. Really managing stock density for the outcome so desired. And this is where we've learned, the guys that I've worked with that have been in the holistic type management or regenerative grazing, that have been with this for 30 and 40 years, what we come back to is how do they use that stock density as a tool to rebuild the soil health. It's not just improving the plant composition, and it's not just about making sure that we've got a lot of ground cover, but what we want to do is improve the soil health. And there's some indicators that are out there, and that's why I handed out that little booklet, the little multifold. You know, within that, there are some easy indicators to be able to tell whether you're making any difference or not. And we'll talk about those more here in a little bit. But this is what we want to do. It's the key tool to regenerative grazing, or what I call regenerative grazing or regenerative ranching. And it's the active management of time and space. You know, we understand we all have a limited amount of time, and that's where I say that stock density, when we apply it, you want to make sure that you're doing it when you've got the time, but you got to know that we're controlling space as well. So this is what we're really trying to work toward going forward. All right, so get down to the principles themselves. You know, the first one I have is maintain stocking rate below carrying capacity. Now the challenge is, this is what long-term rainfall looks like for this region of Minnesota. Now, I don't know if we're right here or just how close we are in that little area, but you can see you've got rainfall that does this. It looks like to me y'all are in a pretty good wet spell for a period of time, according to that data. Of course, every site's different, but your average rainfall is about 27 inches. How do you manage for average? In our part of the country, people say they want to manage for that average year, but if you manage for the average year and we get a drought, it takes 2 years to recover. So if you're managed for the average, you're already behind. So you can't just stock for the average year. You've got to have some sort of flexibility built in order to maintain your improvements over time, or you're just going to be going backwards. But I have a simple assessment. It's been the best one that I've come up with, because as I've consulted with producers, I have this one question that I'll ask them. Okay, how many months a year do you feed hay, or do you plan to feed hay, or do you have extended hustling? What I call extended hustling, you got out there on native grass and you're getting into the residual. You're grazing below your desired residual. You know, how many months do you do that? And for every month that we do that, you're overstocked by at least 8.3%. Now, where does that number come from? 12 months divided into 1 month equals 8.3%. So I'd sit there, I'd talk with these guys on the phone, they'd call up and say, you know, I've got this problem, you know, we're feeding way more hay than we've ever done. You know, feed's high, fertilizer's high, I've got more weeds. You know, what's this problem? Well, he's probably overstocked, but you just don't come out and say that. You got to work into it. So I'll ask them, I say, well, how much hay do you feed? And they'll tell me in our part of the country, 3 months. You know, that's the pat answer that everybody has used forever. We feed hay for 3 months. So I'll ask a few more questions. And I say, okay, well, specifically, when did you start feeding hay this last year? And you can see them thinking a little bit, and they say, well, it's probably right. You know, well, the family it was right at Thanksgiving. Okay, 3 months, right at Thanksgiving. Well, when did you stop feeding hay? And they'll say, well, you know, spring was a little late this year, so, you know, it was probably about the 1st of April. Okay, December, January, February, March, 1st of April, 4.5 months. He said he's going to do 3. He's at least a month and a half overstocked, and I've never seen his place. These are the things that we learn about ourselves, but we got to be honest with ourselves and have real information. So this is what we want to do. 8.3% provides no flexibility within your grazing operation. So that's what we really want to focus on is how much do we need? And you know, in this part of the country, you're going to have hay sometime. You may not be able to graze year round, but you know about what you have to feed. I know in my part of the country, I don't have to feed anything. We've done it for 3 years. But I adjust my stocking rate. Make sure that I can do that. So what I use and what I like to refer to is what I call, quit hitting that same button, is our forage growth curve and reserve herd days. This is for southern Oklahoma. And you can see that this is what how we expect our forage to be produced by month over here on this axis, and cumulatively over here on this axis. This is what it looks like. By the time I get to the 1st of October, I've got everything that I expect to grow for the season on my warm season perennial pastures. Now, I can adjust that a little bit if I've got some cool season, but that's what I'm expecting. Now, a reserve herd day is, take for example, if today it froze, it stopped all growth. If I run my cattle through all these pastures, through my typical grazing rotation, how many days can they graze before they get down to their eating into that residual? That's all it is. But you take that at different points in time. So what I'm looking for right here is I come through here and I know what I want using these little calibrations. By the time I get to end of July, I need to have at least 270 reserve herd days to get me to spring plus 30 days. Now, why plus 30 days? Well, in our part of the country, we can stockpile forage pretty good. Now, it may not have a whole lot of protein, but it'll have plenty of energy. And so you get that new growth coming in addition to the old growth that's there, and they're grazing it on a daily basis. They're going to eat a little of everything. And as a result, their manure never gets very watery. It stays good consistency. They continue to graze, and they don't lose condition and causes a whole lot of stress on the animals. And as I've heard others speak of, you also have less health issues with the cows and the calves later in the summer. So if we can just keep our crude protein and TDN ratio of about 1 to 4, we're in pretty good shape. But in order to do that, I've got to have a little bit of reserve. Other places you may have to have hay, and we've done that as well. So if I look at this one more time, I expect my reserve herd days to accumulate very rapidly in the spring, kind of plateau, and then to get 30 days into spring, this is what it's got to look like. Now, I can do my monitoring any time of the year. And during the drought these last 3 years there at Noble, I had the guys doing it every 2 weeks. Because I wanted to know as soon as possible how much below my reserve herd days that it needed to be so I could pull my trigger. We had contingency plans that if we were if we only had 80% of our expected growth early in the season, by the 1st of June, we're already going to plan to destock. Because right about that time, we're going to get ready to put bulls out, And we calve a little later. So I want to make that decision before the bulls go out. Because I don't want to disturb the cows once the bulls, are with cows. So we'll make our first culling, and that's what we've done for the last 3 years. We were at about 700 head of cows. We have 13,000 acres of ranches. A lot of it's pretty rough country. But what we do is that we had 700 cows before the drought. We have just continually brought them down, and we have not carried stockers. And normally we'll run 500 to 1,000 head of stockers in addition to the cows. So depending on the year, that's where we want to be. The neat thing about all this is that we are also tracking the profitability. In the last 3 years, how many years did we think we made money? All 3 years. The reason why we did, because we planned for it. We planned ahead. We sold cattle early at a proper value, and we planned not to feed. I've got 1 month of reserve that we planned for. We've got most of that hay, and what hay we fed, we were actually using it for in-place hay feeding to add organic matter to areas that have been treated with chemicals for so long, I can't get nothing to grow except pretty warm season grasses. So that's what we're wanting to do. So this is one of the concepts. If I'm working with this, I know I'm way ahead in managing for my future. And I'm better equipped to implement a contingency plan at the proper time. Okay. Number 2, leave ample forage after grazing. This is back to the intensity. We've all heard of the take half, leave half rule, but I'm not talking half of the plant. If you're with us today out in the field, there's 2 parts of that plant leaf. There's that lower part. It's usually, most of these tall grasses around here, about 6 inches. And then there's a little ligule, and then above it's the true leaf. That's where most of the photosynthetic activity are occurring. When I'm talking taking half the leaf, I mean half the leaf or less. And that's where I want to leave the residual at. Now, early in the spring, I want to graze the grass up. So I'm taking about 1/3 and moving on. You're saying, man, you're leaving a whole lot out there. Yes, I am. But also what we know is on a lot of these perennial forages, if you graze it early, that activity actually stimulates tillering within the plant itself. So as a result, we get more tillers, means more leaves, and all I had to do was just top it instead of graze it hard. Because if it has plenty of root supply, and we'll talk about that here shortly, if the roots are still actively growing, it will tiller. If we start taking too much of it, what happens is that those plants won't tiller. It's got to maintain the plant that's already existing. So it's all critical on how we look at it. I have a little saying, it takes grass to grow grass. I use the example when I was going to college, I did quite a bit of lawn mowing for a lot of little older people. And I always liked those that were little widowers. The widows. The widows liked their grass, their yards looking pristine all the time. They wanted it growing tall. And when it was growing tall, guess how often I had to come back to mow it? Every week. But if they had a husband, he'd come out there and he'd say, Hugh, he says, you're coming back too soon. I want you to take that down and drop that another inch. He says, I don't want to see you for 2 weeks. The more grass we left, the faster it would grow. It's the same thing with the cattle. If that's what we want, more grass, leave more with every grazing event. And so every grazing event, you may have some sort of harvest efficiency. I don't care what it is. Just know that you want to try to stay below half until you get past what I call the equinox. Later in the summer, then you begin to change that just a little bit because you're not going to get near the same effect as you will early in the spring. Okay, point 3. Allow full recovery before each grazing event. We've been caught guilty in our own places as we get into the spring. Some of these areas that we grazed late, right before frost, they were trying to get recovered, and then it frosted. It never really got recovered. Come spring, they start all over again. We've hit that plant with a double whammy. First, it never recovered after the grazing event. 2, we hit it with cold and winter season. And then on 3, what I try to avoid is not coming back first thing in the spring to graze those areas again. But sometimes we have to. what we try to do, if we can, is give that for a full flush. And how do you know if a plant is fully mature, ready for grazing? Talking with Jim Garrish, he says the rule that he uses is that you want 3 mature leaves per tiller. So you get down there and look at that plant and see if you've got 3 mature leaves. And how you know if you got a mature leaf? Because you can separate that lower part of the leaf, the sheath, from the actual leaf area, because there's a little ligule in it. I should have brought one of those plants here. But that's how you know. You need 3 of those or more, and then it's ready. And then if you see some of those older leaves out there just beginning to senesce or die back at the tips, you know it's ready to graze. So that's what we're looking for, is that indication that they're ready. And on those pastures that we grazed late in the fall, right before frost, those are the ones I'm paying most attention to, making sure they got recovered before we come back. So here we go. We want longer recovery periods, typically 40 to 120 days. The drier it gets, the further west you go, it may be years before you get the full recovery. You may have the rest, but it's recovery what we're looking for. Again, we want that 3 mature leaf stage, and we'd prefer to graze it late phase 2. Now, with you've got some growing cattle and you're trying to finish them, you may cheat on that a little bit. But in order to optimize forage production, forage quantity, and forage quality, I want to make sure that I'm grazing at that late phase. Because remember, I'm not taking all the plant when I'm grazing it. I'm trying to give part of that back to the land itself. I want to feed the organisms that are there. So if I can do a little bit of trampling, I can feed the macroorganisms, who in turn continue to feed other microorganisms, as well as the plant as they exchange sugars. So that's what I'm really striving to do. So late phase 2, early phase 3. We've all seen this curve, but this is where I call kind of that optimal grazing for soil health. And we're always striving to do that. Now, it's imperfect, but that's what we're trying to achieve at any given time. All right, recovery periods, this is what they look like. We graze faster early in the growing season. It slows down as soil moisture wanes. But note, on these annual forages, when you're on these annual cover crops, once you've got them ready to graze, you want to be back out there every time they're ready to graze. So it may be less than 30 days. It just depends on the growth rate. That's why it's important to go out and make your observations. Don't just walk 2 or 3 steps in there. You need to walk into the field, look at it, and assess all the forages, especially the ones that you know that are going to be the most palatable and most desired by the livestock. All right. We all talk about paddocks, pastures. Of course, the more pastures you have or paddocks you have, the more rest and recovery you can build in naturally. This is just a little slide that shows that. Where you come down here, you can have about 90% recovery if you get over that 30 paddock range. But rest and recovery aren't the same. Recovery only occurs if the plant's actively growing. So you can find times during the winter, of course, it's not going to be actively growing, although the roots are still alive and functioning. Now, in the drought, when you're not getting much growth, are you getting any recovery? Not much. It's still just rest, but recovery only occurs when the plants are actively growing. So we got to keep that in mind. Down there where we've had those 3 years of drought, we had the last half of the summer where we received basically no rest. I mean, no recovery. It just got rest. We didn't get any recovery. I can't count that. So we want to count the recovery periods, not just the rest. All right, principle 4, rest about 15 to 20% of your pastures for an entire growing season. And I'm going to put a caveat with that. If you have pastures that are not in very good condition. If you've got good condition pastures, you don't have to worry about that. How many of y'all read the book of Leviticus lately? How many have ever read the book of Leviticus? I tell you what, that is some heavy reading. Yeah, don't do it. If you really want to get anything out of it, don't do it before you go to sleep. I just tell you that. But the book of Leviticus has a rule that says, but on the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath rest. If you divide that 7 into 1, that's somewhere between 15 and 20%. I've seen more improvement on pastures where individuals will take a pasture that's been abused, give it the entire growing season rest to recover, and then start grazing after frost. And then, of course, maintain lots of residual. It just jump starts pastures. If it was good for God's people, I'm sure it should be good for us too. All right, this gets back into the timing, the season of use, the stage of maturity of the plants. Understand what was occurring when you grazed it last and what type of recovery it's going to need in order to be prepared for the next grazing event. I already talked about grazing the grass up in the spring. We want to attain peak photosynthesis at some point in time during the growing season for every pasture. If you get farther west where you've got 10, 12, 15 inches of rainfall, that may not occur in one season. It may take 2 seasons to get there, sometimes 3. But we want that full recovery before we come back. Number 5, top graze grasses during the active growing season. We always talk about taking the upper half. I'd take even less than that than the half. I'd look at a third. And the reason why, if you've seen this grass, is we remove more than half the leaf tissue. The roots below the plant stop growing. They can't support them, the amount of leaf area that's left can't support all the roots that are there. They have to start dropping roots. Now, roots are going to continually turn over, but you want it to be part of the natural attrition, not forced attrition. And this is what we get here, is when you graze more than that, they shut down and start sloughing roots because they have to build enough tissue above ground to be able to support the additional root system. That's why I say we want to top graze. Move really fast so that those plants are recovering and the roots never shut down because they continue to supply moisture, nutrients, and they can store the carbohydrates that are coming from the leaf tissues above. So this is what we're wanting to do, top graze, and this is why. So this gets back to duration. In order to do that, most of the time, we've got to be moving these cattle quickly. How long does it take before grass starts regrowing? How many days? 5? One comment. Kind of depends. But for the most part, early in the growing season, it takes about 3 days for a plant really to start growing. When you start getting in drier climates, it's going to be 5, maybe 6. But you've got to be watching it in order to know that. So we really like to have those days 1 to 3 days, and we want to make sure that we prevent the repeat grazing of grazed plants. Because if they repeat that grazing event on the same plant, you're probably dropping below that 50%. And then they start sloughing roots. And then you slow your recovery time substantially. It takes about 3 weeks for those plants to have enough tissue above ground in order to start growing new roots. So you've just delayed your recovery 3 weeks whenever you do that. And so we want to make sure we get as much potential in the spring as possible, because what we miss out on in the spring, odds are we're not going to catch up later in the season. All right, now the question I get a whole lot is, does it make that much difference whether I move daily or weekly? Your context is going to tell you whether you can move daily. But if I'm going to move daily, I'm going to emphasize that early in the growing season for the reasons that we just said. But we try to do that at one of our ranches. We've got a project that we're doing with Michigan State, Colorado State, University of Wyoming, and on our ranches, where we're putting 2 herds on these ranches. Now, I don't like 2 herds, I want 1. But with this project, that's what it required, was 2 herds. One that's managed prescriptively. They're coming back to these pastures on about a 5 to 7 day rotation. They're coming back to those pastures every 75 days. That's the rotation. It's kind of a lot of people try to use in our part of the country. It's sort of a standard. You're going to come back when we've got grass, and whether it needs to be grazed or not, we're going to graze it anyhow. But it's a rotation. And on the other one, it's grazed adaptively. It's when the plants are ready, we decide when it's going to be grazed. But each one of those pastures, we subdivide in paddocks, so we're moving them at least daily. Sometimes in the spring, we're moving them multiple times a day. Now, this here is the difference. Forage production, we have paired pastures. They have about the same forage production, the same potential, same range sites. So we've matched these up as best we can. Daily versus about weekly, I get 43% more grazing days. Now, How would you like to be able to carry 43% more animals on your ranch? Now, Dawn, y'all increased your stocking rate quite a bit when you went to daily grazing. This is the difference. This is real data that I didn't even, I had nothing to do with it. These are the researchers that are collecting it, but we know that we can get that on equal pastures. So it justifies being able to manage it if you have the resources to do it. All right, principle number 6, increase the number of pastures to 30 plus. Now I'm going to go through some math real quick. This gets back to some work Jim Garris has done and on his studies for years. The equation here is number of pastures equals 365 days divided by the number of rotations, and I'm going to give you the difference between a dry and a wet environment, times the length of the desired grazing events. In other words, before the plants start to regrow. So this is what that will look like. So going to the next level, in dry country, plan 1 rotation for each 10 inches of annual precipitation. In wet country, you plan 1 rotation for each 7 inches. Now, would you consider yourself dry or wet? And it may depend on the rain site. If you've got some rain sites that are a little dry, you may look at it a little differently. Our length of grazing events in the dry country, about 6 days, 3 days in wet country. So there's the calculation. In dry country, at 27 inches, the rainfall is 2.7 cycles. We decided here is going to be used 6 days. 16 is the number divided into 365, 23 pastures on dry country. That's what we need to have a really good rotation to manage the way we want to. On wet country, we're going with 3 days here, 7 inches here. It moves us all the way up to 32. So that's what we're looking at, 32 paddocks or pastures that we can do some sort of rotation in order to get the maximum benefit on the soil health. All right, grazing principles. Number 7, apply high stock density grazing with excess grass. And I define high stock density, if you're moving daily or more, you're probably using high stock density. Anytime you go into a rotation, you're using stock density. But when we start moving multiple times a day or daily, that's when we really begin to use stock density, for the positive effects. Now we know this is what they typically do. It decreases selectivity. It also creates herd impact if you really move them in tight, and we can reset overly mature pastures. And the most important part of it, when we get to these higher stock densities and we can have a trample effect, we also feed the biology. The more biology that we can feed, the more material we lay down, the better outcomes we're going to have on our soil health, because we actually increase the speed in which the nutrients are being able to cycle. And then we get to the ultra high stock density. I use that with caution. Need to have a good reason to do it. If I've got some opportunities in the peak growing season where I want to lay some annuals down so I can really boost my soil health, I'll apply it then. If we have seasonal transitions where I need to get the cool season off so the perennials can come up, we'll use it then. If we have an abundance of mature pasture and I want to lay it down so that I can really feed the soil, then we can apply this ultra high stock density. In place hay feeding. We'll do it to improve some of the areas, and sometimes growing and finishing. When we've got these growing cattle, if I can do a leader follower type program, I'll move the one set in front, and right behind it, even though the calves, the growing cattle will be moved multiple times a day, then we'll move the cows behind them on a daily basis. We have the dual effect, and we still can have the impact we're looking for. So I put in here, we want to embrace ultra high stock densities when you can. Because not everybody can do it, nor should you do it all the time. I think if there's a time and a place, it's back to, do you have a purpose and how can you use it to your benefit? And when you do it, you want to vary stock densities. This is one of our grazing schools where we go out there and we show what 1,000,000 pounds per acre look like. A lot of people are afraid to get to higher stock density because they're afraid they're going to mess something up. How many have loaded out a truckload of cattle? How many pounds of cattle are on the truck? Usually about 48,000 pounds, what you shoot for. What's the stock density in a truck? If you put it on a per acre basis, it's about 2.4 million pounds per acre, if I recall correctly. Are they stuffed in there? Can they move around? Sure. And if we get down to 1 million pounds, it's not as intensive as it is, but you don't want to leave the animals when you do that. You got to be out there, you got to be observing, you got to make sure you get the desired effect before you move them. That's what it looks like after 15 minutes grazing. Now, how many of y'all want to be moving cattle every 15 minutes? Other than me. I love it because I get out there and I get to watch the livestock, get to see their behavior, get to see the changes, get to see the impact firsthand. But here's some actual results on some of our ranches. We got some pretty rough country. Right here you can see a lot of brush. When we came in there and we mulched it. But I could put those cattle, cattle don't typically like brush. They'll eat a little bit, but they don't like it. But what we would do is we'll come in there in the evening, about 5, 6 o'clock. We'd take about 2 to 4 acres there and then lock those mothers and their babies in there overnight. No water, no anything. And during the early part of the season, they don't need a whole lot of water. And what are they going to do? They're going to go around, they're going to mill around a little bit, eat a little bit of whatever's there, and then they're going to pee and poop and all that good stuff. And then they get up in the morning, and what do? They pee and they poop and all that. And then when you come out there, that's what it looks like next. Did they eat it all? No. Did they have a positive impact? Yes. This is where they'll go the next day. And then they still go out after we turn them loose in the morning, they fill up, everybody's happy. Now the first night they're not too happy with us. The second day they're not too happy. By the time we got to the third day, business as usual. So we have to be persistent when we want to do it. But in those areas where we've mulched and we've got this biology occurring, we're seeing greater recovery of our pasture grasses that we actually want. Now, we do it pretty routinely in some of these places where we have lots of forage production. On this site right here, we put in 1 million pounds per acre, and we do that pretty regularly because we get about 8,000 to 10,000 pounds of dry matter. And on country down in Oklahoma, that's a lot of production. It's on this range site, it's greater than what the NRCS says should be on those range sites for a favorable year. In fact, it's twice. But is it possible? It is. This is what it looks like when they come out of there. Plenty of residual except right around the water. And then it's just a mat that's about this thick. It recovers rapidly. We also use it for different times when we're getting ready to plant cover crops. Take out what's there, come in there, put a no-till drill in it, and then we have grazing later in the spring, later in the winter, early spring that we need it at the right time. All right. Now we kind of understand what the principles are. The best thing that we can do to encourage people to do is get out and try it for yourself. You need to get out and see what you can do, but I have a little bit of caution when we start getting into these ultra-high stock densities because everybody wants to try to gravitate toward that. What I would say is that you need to really focus on a safe-to-learn approach, and what that really is the hows, wheres, and whys. The how, just use existing resources. Take an area that you can manage well. What we want to do is use a minimum amount of supplies, try not to buy a whole lot of stuff, apply your soil health principles and the rules of grazing management. Where? In a place that's easy to manage well. Usually that's right in front of your house. Where you got a pretty good soil, something that's very forgiving, some place that you can go in there and you can do it because by golly, you're going to take a little more effort. It's right there in front of you and you don't have an excuse to get away from it. And you want to be able to observe the grazing activities. When do you want to do it? When you have lots of forage in a plan. And what I mean by a plan is that you can only want to do it for a certain period of time. You want to make sure this is what you can do. And then if that's the area you're going to focus on, you can return back to your normal, whatever your management approach is, and then come back to that area based off of the plan. Come back and try to maintain that one area. And as you see the improvements, you can begin to expand it out. The biggest mistake, or one of the biggest mistakes I see with a lot of producers, they try to do it all at one time and then get frustrated. Start with what you can do well and then begin to move out. We can't take it all on at one time most of the time. This is an example of what we did at one of our ranches. This is about a 50-acre Bermuda grass pasture. All the water was down here on this end of it, and it all comes this way when it rains. But we'd always had about 4 pastures. We could subdivide it, keep the cattle moving, maintain some stock density. We never put a back fence on there because the cattle aren't going to come back where they've already he pooped and peed on. They've got the good out of it. Then we keep on moving. Then we'd go to the next one. But we also sit here and looked at it and go, well, it sure would be nice since you have this gradients coming this direction. What if we put a water line down here on this side? This is a very productive area. This would be a priority of where I'd put a watering system. So that's what we did. We put in a watering system along that road. We put these quick connects, which we love. And then we got a little portable trough. They can water 130 cows with no trouble, and their calves. People ask me, what's that? That's for the calves to get up there to get a drink. These are what it looks like with the quick connects. And then as we manage it, we can change those fences any way we want to. And those cattle are always happy to go to that next pasture. So whether we subdivide it 3, 4, 5 times, it's really about the forage and the impact that we want to have. And we rarely put the fences back in the same place. So you always have that beauty of it. It really gets down to water infrastructure is probably the most worthwhile investment. If you've got to do that, you want to find an area that's going to be very productive where your return on investment will be worthwhile. If I can get 40-something% increase in stocking rate because of my improvements on that one area, that's what I want to do. And it's going to be on those areas where it's most productive, and you usually get more than the 40% increase. Okay, so water infrastructure, using these portable troughs. We have herds that up to 250 to 300 head, and they can water out of either one of those, as long as you got enough recharge. And that's one thing that we had to put in with those big storage units that allowed us to recharge that's necessary. Now you can imagine, this is our big ranch, 5,000 acres. And you can see where all our water troughs are now, going in this summer, going in next year. The red lines are in the future. But anything that's blue are already there. Prior to, well, in fact, that first year of the drought, we didn't have any of this over here on this side. We had a water well at the top. We have a water well down here, and neither one of them were very good. We were all pond water. And we couldn't graze any of this over here on the east side because didn't have water. Now, it got to that season of rest that we were talking about, which really benefited it. But on the other hand, now that we've got the water in there, we can make good use of it on a year-round basis. All right, 8, plan, monitor, and adapt. Now, what I like to do is have some sort of big sheet. Not everybody likes it. Most people get frustrated because if I fill all this stuff out, you know it's going to be obsolete in 2 weeks. And they're right. But what we do is we put it on a computer program. We can manage it and adjust these as we want to. But I want them scoping out that full year based off of last year's plan and the year before's plan. So we record what we're tracking, and then we use that so that we're not doing the exact same thing year after year. So we plan, we take that little area that was highlighted, and then we monitor and actually adapt going forward in a short periods of time. We also do a lot of Haney tests. In fact, on all our properties, we've got 136, 37 permanent sites where we're monitoring twice a year. Soil test, we're doing transects, we're monitoring infiltration. It's a lot of work, but what we're trying to do is determine what are the outcomes relative to our management. And fortunately, we've got a research element, and it complements some of our research goals. But the big thing is we want to examine the soils regularly. And really what it is back to what you've got in front of you. Being able to look at the soil color. First off, you're going to have cover, make sure there's not erosion, but we want to be sure that your soil structure is what you want it to be. We saw some beautiful soil this morning. Very crumbly, beautiful dark black, biological activity. We saw plenty of it, earthworms and some other organisms in it. You want to see more over time. So we like to do these at regular intervals. Every spring, it's basically about the same month, and the same thing in the fall, about the same month. And rooting resistance, looking for those areas where we know that we got some structural problems, and the smell. These soils smell good. Ours typically don't have a smell, which tells me that we still need a lot more organic matter and organisms in it. And then look for these different organisms. I don't know that y'all have horn toads up here, but used to when I was a kid, we caught a lot of horn toads. You might have seen some years ago. But when I was a kid, we used to get those little milk cartons at school, and we'd go out there and we'd catch those and see how many we could stuff in those little milk cartons. You can't even find one to put anywhere. Now we're beginning to see on some of our ranches and some of these areas that have been managed holistically or regeneratively for years, the return of the horned toads, which is really impressive for people like us. And then these dung beetles. You know, we were using a lot of ivermectin, and we still use a little bit on the cattle coming in as, we use it in one spot. Yeah, we bought cattle, we may have to do something like that, but on those cow herds, we're doing a study with the Oklahoma State University, and they're monitoring the differences between our dung beetle counts versus the neighbors, and it's 3, 4, 5 magnifold higher on ours. So we're excited about what we're seeing on the recovery there. Now, does it make a difference? I think it does. You know, on that one ranch that we've had under the holistic management since 1988, you can see from 88 to 97 on an over-abused, wore out old piece of land. It was mostly ragweed, a few 3-awns, a few desired plants here and there, but for the most part, it was low succession. We saw, this is the number of pastures, as we begin to increase over time, we saw a 350% increase in our animal unit days. This is also the place now, almost 30 years later, that we have forage production greater than what the NRCS range gives in a favorable rainfall on those same range sites. So does it make a difference? It took 40 years to get to that, but it makes a big, big difference. You got to start sometime. This is another ranch that I've worked with. They bought it in winter of 2005. It was one that I said, you know, I can't identify any plants that are out there. I said, he asked what I would do. I said, if you're going to buy it, I said, I would give it a year of recovery. You got good soils, the soil type's right, but give it a year of recovery. So that's what he did. He gave it a full year recovery, and then he started grazing it during the wintertime. 2008, you know, he had a little bit of brush coming in, some undesirable woody plants. He went in there and just spot sprayed those little plants. This down here, big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, little blue stem, a whole diversity. But by the time he went from here to here, he was moving at least on a daily basis. So can it happen? It can happen relatively short, but going from here to here required that full growing season rest to get started right. Some of y'all may have seen this. This is a site in southwestern Oklahoma. You know, it didn't get a whole lot of rain. Average rainfall is about 20 inches. We had one guy over here on this side that actually had a soil health field day there in the late summer, early fall. The neighbor wasn't there, so they went over on the other side and kind of did a little infiltration test on his side as well. They had a 5.3 inch rainfall event over a couple of days. The management on both sides prior to about 2006 was conventional tillage, wheat, fallow, wheat, fallow, wheat, fallow. Always wheat. Been doing that forever. No grazing, no cover crops. Infiltration rate 0.6 of an inch an hour. Only holding about 16,000 gallons of water in that upper profile per acre. Now, the fellow over here on the left, he began the soil health activities. He started planting no-till cover crops. He also began using livestock, grazing management over with the excess forage. Infiltration rate was 2.9 inches an hour, 78,000 gallons per acre. All the water on this side is running off. What happened to his? He got the same rainfall. It all soaked in. That's what we're really trying to achieve. We can do that with these perennial pastures extremely easily. We can see that the cropland can do that. Y'all have wonderful cropland acres up here. That introduced pasture area in our part of the country is a little bit of a challenge, but that's what we're striving for. So briefly, I'm going to cover a little bit about using bricks. We talked about that. Bricks, for me, is one of those tools that we can use as another indicator, like looking below the surface. Are we making any improvement in our soil health? You know, we look through the little refractometer. What we'd like to see is these numbers beginning to go from 5 to 8%. And I've got plenty of 5% on my ranches there in Oklahoma. But just a measure of sugars, it's especially useful in pasture finishing cattle. And it's really what we want to look at is that in addition, not in replace of, but in addition to the crude protein in TDN. Because livestock are always going to have different requirements. If they're growing, whether they're finishing, whether they're mature, we still got to pay attention to that. But if we can have higher Brix values, we have an added benefit. And to me, it's just talking about nutrient density. It's just another name. How nutrient dense are the forages that we're feeding? Our ideal Brix range would be at least greater than 8%, preferably over 15%, and we saw most everything at 8% or better. In fact, some of them were up around 15, 20% out there in the field this morning, and it wasn't even in the afternoon. Afternoons where you really want to test it. So we saw the ideal range. I still want my TDN to be about that 70, maybe a little less than 18% crude protein. I want to have that balance ratio of about 4 to 1, 3.5, 5.5 to 1 TDN to crude protein ratio. I still need that. But if I can get the Brix values up, we get this type of value. Average daily gain from 5 to 8% can jump up to 1, 2%, or 2 pounds per average daily gain. 8 to 12, 2 to 2.5, 12 to 15, 2.4 to 2.8. These are values that make a big difference if you're grazing livestock, especially if you've got growing cattle. So the more that we can get these numbers up, the more it's not only an indicator of soil health, it also has a benefit to our livestock performance. Okay, how to take a Brix. Most of y'all already know this. You want a sunny day, you like to do it in the afternoon. Select the portion that the livestock are actually going to graze. Rub it together, squeeze out a little bit of juice, look at the refractometer and see what it looks like. A little bit about Noble. This is how you can find out about us. We have a website. We've got a lot of articles that go out. You can sign up for a newsletter, which is an e-newsletter. You get electronic email about once a week. Also, if you're really interested in some of the courses that we're trying to provide some education around soil health, grazing, and profitability, you can find a course here. So with that, this is my contact information. If you'd be interested, I'll be around the rest of the day and of course tomorrow. Is there any questions that I could answer at this point? Yes, sir.
What other performance methods are you tracking? You mentioned daily gain.
Yes, sir.
Soil health, report values. Are there any others that you are tracking?
Yeah, well, on our own ranches, what we're trying to track, we're tracking profitability. We're tracking all the production metrics. We're also looking at doing complete enterprise analysis, return on investment on a lot of the infrastructure that we're working on, in addition to all the soil health, a monitoring plan similar to like a land EKG type work. So we want to see how all this begins to add up, not only the soil health, but the plant composition across our pastures, as well as being able to look at the performance of livestock, whether they be sheep, goats, and cattle, or the profits. So we're also doing a lot of stocker cattle on that sell-buy type principle, where we're buying them at, with whatever that hole in the market is, keeping them up to the point where we can sell them and then turning them as quickly as we can. So we're looking at all of it. Most of it we're just getting started, but I can tell you that through the last 3 years when we made the transition, the year before we made the transition, we lost money. Noble Research Institute, you got money, you probably got, we got pockets to cover it. These last 3 years we've made money, and the worst year we still made over $150,000. Years before it was closer to $200,000 to $250,000. So as we begin to look at it long term, we want to make sure that we have those reports by ranch. We got 6, we call them ranches, but ranch entities that we're managing that surely can relate to somebody within our geographic area anyway. And we'll make that available to whoever wants to see it. Good question, Tucker. Anything else? Yes, sir. Jason.
You mentioned the ivermectin. How long does that take from application to get out of the system of the cow and the manure so it won't harm dung beetles?
Yeah, I'm not the best one to actually answer that question, but one of the problems with that is you've got different type of ivermectin products now. You got long range, and there's another one that's out there, I believe, that has, the purpose is to have longer control. So the half-life gets longer and longer, but it still affects the reproductive function in particular of the dung beetles even past the half-life. So what we try to do is minimize as best we can. If we have to use it, we're going to alternate products. If it's in the spring, we're going to use something more like a safeguard. And then the animals that we treat, we get rid of. We treat them, keep them in one spot, and then we sell them. And then the stalkers, they'll probably get an ivermectin and a safeguard. And then we keep them in one area until we at least, typically they're going to be there 3 weeks. And then we try to get them out on pasture, and we know which areas that they're going to go to. But we're monitoring the dung beetles on that, so I'll have a better answer for you in about 2 years.